With the bonfire lit, the story begins. Terror on the Mexico highway, La Mala Hora. Mexico. On a deserted road in Latin America, where the night seems to never end, travelers travel with a terrible legend, La Mala Hora. Those who find it will never be the same again. They say it is a dark entity, an omen of death and madness, which manifests itself in the darkest hours of the morning, when Guillermo Garcia, a skeptical journalist specializing in debunking urban legends, decides to investigate reports about La Mala Hora. He finds himself trapped in a spiral of inexplicable events. With every kilometer traveled, your sanity is tested. Witnesses disappear, dreams become confused with reality, and a sinister shadow watches him from afar. What seemed like just a folk tale turns into a macabre chase. Now, Guillermo needs to discover the truth before the last hour takes him forever. Guillermo Garcia always liked challenges. As an investigative journalist specializing in debunking urban legends, he has previously exposed elaborate hoaxes and superstitions that don't tell stories to scare children. But when I received an anonymous email with the subject line, "She's waiting for you," I felt an unexpected chill. The body of the message only contained a link to an obscure forum and a name he'd heard before but never taken seriously. La Mala Hora. The legend, popular in parts of Latin America, described an entity that appeared on deserted roads, always in the dead of night. Those who crossed his path suffered hallucinations, went crazy, or worse, disappeared without a trace. The email sent a direct invitation, and Guillermo couldn't resist trying to follow the story's trail. After a few hours of research, he found disturbing reports. Drivers who spotted a woman dressed in black on the side of the road and, moments later, completely lost track of time. Some swore they were driven for hours without remembering a single mile driven. Others would say they saw their reflections distorted in car mirrors, as if something else was driving in their place. Driven by adrenaline and the possibility of a great story, Guillermo packed his backpack with the essentials: a camera, a voice recorder, and a notebook for notes. The road that led to the place of legend was a few hours away, in a less busy area. What he didn't know was that this would be the last time his life felt normal. As night fell, he took the highway into the unknown. The sky was clear, but there was a strange feeling in the air, as if something invisible was lurking. On the car radio, there is static surgery between songs, an insignificant detail, but one that caused him slight discomfort. He checked the GPS and the destination was still 70 miles away. It was then that he noticed something strange. The road was too deserted. Even though it was a remote stretch, it was rare not to come across at least an occasional truck or car. He looked in the rearview mirror and saw only infinite darkness behind him. His heart beat faster. I was completely alone. Or at least that's what he wanted to believe. The tension increased when, upon checking his cell phone, he saw that there was no signal. He conveyed it from the side of his mouth, trying not to let himself get carried away by paranoia. Great start to a horror story, he invented. But deep down, a part of him began to wonder if there was a mistake in following that calling. Then, as he looked at the horizon, he saw it. A silhouette standing on the side of the road. The silhouette on the road was as quick as it appeared. Guillermo blinked a few times, trying to rationalize what he had seen. Maybe it was just a reflex, an illusion caused by tiredness. Still, his chest opened with a bad feeling. He sped up a little more, deciding not to let his fear take over. 15 minutes later, he saw a small gas station on the side of the road. The sign blinked intermittently, emitting an uncomfortable buzzing sound. The place looked like it had been forgotten by time. Rusty gas pumps, cracked walls, and just an old car parked next to the convenience store. Guillermo decided to stop, both to refuel and to get some information about the route ahead. As I got out of the car, I smelled the strong smell of gasoline mixed with something else. Rotten. The weak street light illuminated the place with a sickly yellow glow. I entered the store, where an old radio was humming softly on the counter. The attendant, a thin man with a pale face, gave him a suspicious look before he could even say anything. "Good evening," Guillermo said, forcing a casual tone. "I'm going to fill up at 6. The attendant nodded without saying anything, taking the money without even looking him in the eye. Guillermo hesitated but decided to try to bring up the subject. "Is this road always this empty?" The man paused for a second and then replied without emotion, "If you're smart, turn around and go back to the city." Before you could insist, the sound of a bottle falling echoed from the back of the store. Guillermo turned around and saw an old man sitting in one of the dark corners, holding a glass of cachaça in a shaking hand. Their clothes were dirty with dust and oil, and the visible eyes see something beyond there. The old man laughed softly, a hoarse sound that made the hairs on the back of Guillermo's neck stand up. "You shouldn't be here at this time, stranger," said the old man without looking directly at him. Guillermo moved. "Why? What's with this road?" The old man downed the glass in a single gulp and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Then, finally, I looked up. His eyes were red, almost watery, as if he had seen something no one should see. "If you see her, pray you won't be alone." His voice came out in a message, conveyed with a dark weight. Before Guillermo could ask anything, the attendant knocked hard on the counter, catching his attention. "Don't listen to him," said the man. "They're just stories about old drunk people." Guillermo looked from one to the other, feeling that there was something unsaid there, but he decided not to insist. He paid for fuel, took one last look at the old man and left the store, feeling the weight of the warning he had just received. When he got back to the car and started to fill up, he noticed something engraved on the gas pump, scratched with a blade. It was a single word: "Run." Guillermo left the gas station with a strange feeling weighing on his shoulders. The old man's warning still echoed in his mind. "If you see her, pray you won't be alone." What did he mean by that? Was it just a drunken delusion or a real warning? He tried to convince himself it was the first option, but the word on the gas pump, "run," made his stomach turn. He knew for a few more miles before he noticed something unsettling. The world around seemed dead. There were no other cars, no houses, nor the same recent road signs. Just the dark asphalt cutting across an empty expanse. It was as if he had entered a place where time did not move forward. Then fog started to form. First, a faint blanket of white crawling across the ground, winding between the dry trees on the side of the road. But within minutes, the fog grew thicker, thick as smoke, making every meter ahead an unknown. The car's headlights illuminated only a few meters before being swallowed by the opaque mist. Guillermo increased his speed, paying attention to the path. The feeling of isolation became even more suffocating. The car radio screeched intermittently, as if it was trying to tune into some hidden station, and his cell phone still had no signal. It was absolute silence. No sound of wind, no crickets, no distant engine noise. Only he has an infinite road. It was then that he felt it. That strange and uncomfortable perception of being watched. His eyes moved to the rearview mirror, and his heart nearly stopped. In the middle of the fog, something moves. At first it seemed just an indistinct shadow, a dark blur against the milky mist. But as Guillermo stared, the outline began to take shape. It was a human figure, standing motionless, right in the middle of the road where he had passed seconds ago. He blinked, and in the blink of an eye, the silhouette was closer. Guillermo's fingers tightened on the steering wheel, his chest rising and falling with rapid breathing. He wanted to believe it was just an effect of the fog, a trick of the light, but something inside him screamed that this was not an illusion. It was then that, without him playing it on the radio, a distorted voice appeared among the chirps. "You shouldn't be here." The hiss of the radio dissolved into the suffocating silence of the road, but Guillermo felt his heart hammering against his chest. He took one last look at the rearview mirror, but the dense fog had already swallowed the figure watching him. Was there really something there, or were the darkness and tiredness playing tricks on your mind? He tried to avoid the disturbances and speed up, eager to get off that road as soon as possible. However, just a few minutes later, he saw something on the edge of the asphalt that made him hit the brakes. A stopped car. The vehicle was positioned strangely across the secondary road that connected to the main road. The doors were left wide, open as if the driver had left in a hurry or been forced out. The engine was off and the headlights flickered dimly, as if the battery wasn't running out. Guillermo hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to move forward, but journalistic curiosity overcame fear. He took his cell phone, still no signal, and his flashlight, leaving the car with cautious steps. Approaching the abandoned vehicle, it is clear that the interior was intact. There were no signs of a struggle or blood, just a bag lying on the passenger seat and a cell phone on the dashboard. The device's visor blinked frantically. A missed call from Mommy, the sound of a new ringtone reduced the silence of the road like thunder. The name Mommy flashed on the screen again. Guillermo swallowed hard. Who would leave their cell phone behind, still active? Overcome with hesitation, he reached out and took the device. The ringing stopped the instant his fingers touched the screen. The battery still had enough charge, but the screen turned off on its own, as if the device itself refused to be used. That's when he heard it, a muffled whisper coming from the fog, low, almost imperceptible. "Help me." Guillermo froze. His gaze darted around, trying to find the source of the voice. But the road was still deserted, swallowed by fog. Then in the rearview mirror of the abandoned car, something moved behind him. The message was still reverberating in his ears. Guillermo felt a chill run up his spine as he tried to convince himself that it was all just his mind playing tricks. But something inside him knew it wasn't just imagination. He was not alone. On the road, with his found cell phone still in his hand, he slowly walked back to his car, feeling the weight of silence around him. Each step echoed strangely, as if the road itself was absorbing the sound. When he reached the driver's door, he stopped for a moment to take a deep breath before getting in. His fingers shook slightly as he turned the key in the ignition. The headlights illuminated the dense fog ahead, but when they looked in the rearview mirror, their body froze. There was someone standing behind the car. The female figure was motionless in the middle of the road. His silhouette was indistinct, his contours blurred by the mist, as if he did not completely belong to the world. Guillermo felt his heart accelerate and held his breath. The first thing that came to mind was the old man's warning at the gas station. "If you see her, pray you won't be alone." An irrational impulse made him turn his body in the seat and look back. But when his eyes reached the empty road, there was no one there. His stomach dropped. He had seen it. He was sure. And the scariest thing was that it only appeared in the mirror With his hands sweating, he glanced at the rearview mirror again. The silhouette was now closer. Guillermo's chest rose and fell in rapid breaths. His mind was screaming at him to get out of there, but his body felt frozen at the moment. It was then that the light on the car's dashboard blinked, and the radio, which was off, turned on by itself. Amidst the hiss of static, a female voice echoed low and distorted. "You can't run away." The radio hissed in a low, disturbing tone. The female voice seemed to come from a distant place, crossing time and space to whisper inside Guillermo's car. "You can't run away." The phrase repeats itself, increasingly weaker, until it disappears completely, leaving only static. He tried to turn off the radio, but the button wouldn't respond. The static oscillated, becoming higher-pitched, more shrill, until Guillermo instinctively covered his ears. It was then that he heard something worse. Whispers, low, muffled, as if some voices were speaking at the same time, but without any words being completely understandable. The sound came from all sides, from the back seat. Make a glove compartment, from inside your own head. Guillermo. His name emerged from the murmurs like a needle piercing his sanity. He looked around, feeling his chest pressing down. The rearview mirror still reflected the fog-shrouded road, but something seemed off. This was no longer the same place as before. Fear turned to dread as the suggestions generated distorted screams. There were overlapping voices, high-pitched and uncontrolled, as if something was trying to force him to lose his reason. He covered his ears again, opening his eyes tightly. "This isn't real, this isn't real," I repeated in my mind. But what if it was? When he opened his eyes, he felt dizzy. The car's dashboard showed that it had already been done within the last 2 hours since leaving the gas station. 2 hours. Driving where? The road in front of him looked the same, but his gas tank was still almost full. He was not directed. He hadn't moved. With a shiver running through his body, he looked at the rearview mirror once again. This time, I didn't just see the road. There was a face there. A woman with pale skin and completely black eyes smiled at him. And then, she whispered, his name. Guillermo didn't remember how he got there. A moment ago, he was on the road, trying to understand the waste of time. Now he parked in front of a run-down inn in the middle of nowhere. The sign flashed erratically, some letters burned out, forming the word Posada of Silence. He didn't remember seeing this place on the map, but something inside him told me I needed to go in. The interior of the inn was as depressing as its facade. The walls were yellow with age, the air thick with mold and something metallic, almost like rust or blood. The counter was empty, but a rusty bell invited guests to call for service. Guillermo hesitated. Then the doorbell rang. The ecological sound or the empty reception. No response. The absolute silence gave him goosebumps. Beside the counter, a ledger lay open, covered in dust. He ran his fingers over the names he wrote down, but one caught his eye. Alejandro Ferrer, journalist. Guillermo knew that name. Alejandro Ferrer had disappeared years earlier while investigating La Mala. For Guillermo's heart raced. He's here. Beside the record book, the aforementioned leather-bound notebook was forgotten, as if it had been left in a hurry. He opened the first page. It was a diary, the usual first observations, details about Alejandro's investigation, interviews with drivers and theories about the legend. But as I flipped through the pages, the words became frantic. Entire passages scribbled out, sentences incomplete, as if the author was writing hastily, overcome by fear. Then his blood ran cold. The last pages described exactly what Guillermo was experiencing. The road is wrong. Time is not real. The mirror shows things that shouldn't be there. She called me by name today. If I don't get out of here now, I'll never get out. The last note, written in shaky letters, was the worst. If you found this diary, it means she already knows who you are. Before you could react, a loud noise echoed through the empty halls of the inn. A door closing by itself. And then, in absolute silence, the sound of footsteps approaches. The diary trembled in Guillermo's hands. Every word felt like a direct warning, as if Alejandro Ferrer was trying to warn him from beyond the grave. But the worst was the last sentence. If you found this diary, it means she already knows who you are. A cold wind blew through the deserted corridor of the inn, making a door close by itself with a bang. Guillermo swallowed hard and closed the diary, taking it with him as he went up the stairs to the room he had chosen, the last one at the end of the corridor. He needs time to think. I needed to get out of there as soon as possible. The room was small and depressing. A bed with squeaky springs, an old chest of drawers, and a dingy oval mirror attached to the wall. Guillermo locked the door, left the diary on the bed, and threw himself into the armchair next to it, massaging his temples. His mind pulsed between tiredness and paranoia. Was Alejandro still alive, or La Mala Hora had taken him forever? Little by little, exhaustion overcame tension. Guillermo fell asleep, but his rest was disturbed by distressing nightmares. He saw flashes of meaningless images. An endless road, a clock turning backwards, a woman in black smiling in the dark. A noise in the room made him wake up abruptly. The wardrobe door was open. His chest rose and fell in panting breaths. He was sure that door wasn't open. He tried to get up, but the air around him felt heavy, almost viscous. The temperature dropped sharply, and the dim lamplight blinked twice before turning off completely. It was then that he saw her. A woman in black was standing at the bedroom door. She was tall, leading and back in a black veil that partially covered her face. His eyes were two empty abysses, and his long, thin arms stood at his sides. She didn't move, just watched him in the dim light. Guillermo froze. The room seemed to have been plunged into an unnatural silence. His heart was beating so hard he thought he might die. He can't move. He blinked, and she disappeared. The lamp turned on again by itself, projecting elongated shadows on the walls. Guillermo gasped, trying to regain control over his own breathing. But then, something caught his attention. A note had appeared on the floor, exactly where the woman was. With shaking hands, he bent down and picked up the yellow paper. Only one sentence was written in thin, irregular letters. "You've already been marked." The note seemed to pulse in his hands. Guillermo read those words several times, feeling the weight of their meaning. "You've already been marked." Marked for my... What? For the first time, he didn't want any more answers. I wanted to get out of there. He hurriedly packed his things and left the room, descending the inn stairs with hurried steps. The place was still empty. No staff, no guests. The oppressive silence felt heavier now. As soon as he stepped out into the parking lot, he was struck by a single thought. He needed concrete answers. Still holding Alejandro Ferrer's diary, Guillermo decided to do something he had never done in his investigations. Go to the police. If anyone could give you information about the road, disappearances, or any strange cases, it would be the nearest police station. When he arrived at the small police station in the neighboring town, he was greeted by a grim-faced police officer who seemed a little interested in helping him. "You said you found an abandoned car on the road," said the policeman, bored. Filling out a worn-out form. "Yes," Guillermo replied. Doors open, a cell phone inside. Everything indicated that the driver was simply absent. The officer was silent for a moment. His eyes narrowed, and he closed the folder he was writing in. There are no records of cars abandoned on the road. Guillermo frowned. That can't be right. Must have reported. There is nothing to report. The policeman interrupted dryly. The journalist felt his blood boiling. Something was wrong. So tell me, who owned the car? He insisted, crossing his arms. The police opening gave. The jaw. Behind the counter, another older agent shifted uncomfortably, looking at his colleagues as if he were begging him not to say anything else. But Guillermo noticed a hesitation and knew there was something there. I shouldn't be telling you this, the agent grumbled, lowering his voice. But that car belongs to Javier Ibarra. The name didn't ask anything of Guillermo, but before he could ask further, the older police officer continued. He's been missing for 3 months. A shiver ran down Guillermo's spine. And when was the last time anyone saw him? He said, even though he already suspected the answer. The policeman looked away. On that road, at 3 in the morning. Silence weighed on the environment. Guillermo felt a knot in his stomach. He wanted to continue questioning, but the other officer coughed and walked away, slamming his hand on the counter. We've already told you everything we know. Now go away. The journalist hesitated for a moment, but knew he wouldn't be able to get anything else out of there. As he left the police station, feeling the cold early morning air on his skin, the city seemed too empty, as if it had been forgotten by the world. Deep down, he knew he was no longer just investigating a story. Now he is part of it. The cold early morning air seemed thicker when Guillermo left the police station. The policeman's words echoed in his mind. Javier Ibarra disappeared months ago, on that road. At 3 in the morning, the weight of the revelation opened his chest. Javier was gone exactly in the same place where he found the abandoned car. But how was the vehicle still there? How had no one removed it? Or worse, how did it still have battery power to receive calls? The feeling that something was haunting him was almost unbearable now. Guillermo got into the car and started the engine. He decided to leave that city as quickly as possible. The clock on the dashboard ticked 2:47 a.m. Time was against him. The road was even darker and shrouded in mist, as if the night had deepened in an unnatural way. He drove in silence, his fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. It was then that he saw the first sign. Crossroads 2. km. I frowned. I didn't remember this fork on the way there, but there was the sign, rusty and spray-painted with strange symbols that he couldn't decipher. Alejandro Ferrer's diary was on the passenger seat. An impulse made Guillermo open it again, leafing through the pages until he found a frantically scribbled note. If you come to the crossroads, don't make a mistake. The right path leads to the exit. The wrong path leads to IT. He felt his stomach drop. This was the decision that would define his destiny. The fog grew thicker. He can barely see more than the few meters ahead. The car passed the first warning and soon another one appeared. Crossroads in 500 m. Choose well. Guillermo's heart beat against his ribs as if trying to escape. And then he saw 2 roads opening up before him. One goes left, a narrow potholed road surrounded by dead trees. The other one on the right looked a little better preserved, but the fog there seemed much thicker, as if a supernatural veil was surrounding it. At the exact moment he stopped, the car radio chirped by itself. Among the static, a distorted voice whispered something that made your skin run cold. Wrong choice, and I'll come get you. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. If I chose wrong, La Mala Hora would find it. The car's engine rumbled softly as Guillermo stared at the crossroads in front of him. His fingers sweated against the steering wheel. Left or right? The wrong road found her, and he knew he didn't want to find her. The radio continued to crackle, and the distorted voice whispered unintelligible things. Then, amidst the static, a sentence clearly formed. "I'm already here." Immediately, the car shook violently, as if something invisible had landed on it. The engine stalled without warning, and the dashboard lights flickered before going out. Everything was plunged into complete darkness. Guillermo tried to start the car again, but the key turned wrong. Absolute silence settled around him, but this time it was no ordinary silence. It was a void, a vacuum cleaner, as if the whole world had stopped. His gaze went straight to the rearview mirror, and she was there. In the middle of the road, shrouded in thick fog, the female silhouette approached. His face was not human. It was a shapeless mass of shadows, a hole in reality where the eyes should be, just darkness. Time seemed to slow down. The entity's every movement was distorted, as if it were trapped between dimensions, advancing in erratic leaps. Guillermo's chest rose and fell in rapid, uncontrolled breaths. He can't move. The woman in black stopped right behind the car. The rearview glass cracked on its own, and Guillermo felt a crushing pressure on his chest, as if invisible hands were trying to pull him out of himself. His mind flickered. For a second, he saw the road full of other abandoned cars, people sitting at the wheel with expressions frozen in horror, all those who chose wrong. He wanted to scream, but his voice didn't come out. His entire body shook and his vision became blurred. The entity progressively leaned forward, bringing its face closer to the rear window. Then, "Open your mouth." There were no teeth, no tongue, just an endless abyss. And from the bottom of that black hole, a pale, skeletal hand began to reach out. It was then that Guillermo saw the worst. He wasn't looking at her in the rearview mirror. It was reflected in the windshield. She was sitting in the back seat. Guillermo felt his heart stop for a moment. The chill that ran down his spine was something beyond fear. It was the certainty that his existence was about to be erased. He knew he shouldn't look, that any wrong move could seal his fate, but his instinct failed him. He turned his head, and she was there sitting in the back seat, so close he could almost feel her cold breath brushing the back of his neck. The skin was a veil over something shapeless. The eyes were just deep holes, and the mouth remained open, like an endless well. It was then that "La Mala Hora," he whispered. "Let's play." The voice was a broken noise, like an out-of-tune radio mixed with something human. Guillermo couldn't move. The car was off. The world around seemed still, as if trapped outside of reality. Only he and she already existed. 3 riddles, 3 chances. Get it right and you're out. Get it wrong, and I'll download it. The last word echoed wrongly, as if the entity had difficulty expressing it. But Guillermo understood what he did. If he made a mistake, she would take it for herself. He would become another reflection stuck in the road. He swallowed hard. I had no choice. I needed to play. "First enigma," murmured La Mala Hora. "I exist only at night, but never before dawn. My presence is a warning, but never to the one who sees me. What am I?" Guillermo's mind was spinning. He tried to control his breathing, organize his thoughts. A warning that is never for those who see it? A bad omen, but for someone else? Then he understood. A premonition of death. There was silence. The car shook slightly, and he felt the pressure around him ease for a second. You got it right. The suffering was short-lived. Second riddle, she continues, his voice now closer to his ear. The more you use me, the less I exist. If you try to hold me back, I disappear. What am I? Guillermo felt cold sweat run down his neck. Think. Something that disappears when you try to hold it. Something that wears out when used. Then the answer came. The weather. Another silence, another tremor in the car, another right. But he knew the third would be more difficult. Last riddle. La Mala Hora, he whispered, his voice taking on an almost anxious tone. I am the beginning. And the end. I am the last thing a man can see and the first thing a dead person encounters. What am I? The beginning and the end? The last thing a man sees? The first one a dead person encounters? Guillermo felt his chest pressed. His brain spun, each second seeming slower, as if he were sinking into moved sand. If I made a mistake, if he made a mistake, she would take him forever. He looked in the rearview mirror and that's when you saw it. The darkness within those bottomless eyes. The absolute emptiness of his presence. The answer was right in front of him. He took a deep breath and said, the darkness, the silence that fell was absolute. The fog around the car stopped moving. The radio chirped one last time, and then turned off. He blinked, and La Mala Hora, it was no longer there. The car started by itself. Time started to flow again. The road in front of him opened up again. Guillermo let out a breath that he didn't even know he was trapped in. He won, or at least that's what he lost. Guillermo did so in silence, feeling the weight of what had just happened. He was still there, breathing, alive. But I couldn't feel. Relieved. La Mala Hora had disappeared. But what if that was just part of her game? Alejandro Ferrer's diary was thrown onto the passenger seat, and Guillermo felt the urge to open the last pages again. He frantically flipped through his notes, trying to find something that could explain what came next. But then, something caught his attention. He was not the only journalist who tried to investigate this road. There were names listed in Ferrer's notes, each followed by a piece of data and a brief comment. Javier Ibarra, 3 months ago. Marcos del Valle, 2 years ago. Hugo Ramirez, 5 years ago. They all had something in common. No one ever came back. Guillermo's heart opened. He remembered the images they had seen before, the abandoned cars, the drivers frozen in expressions of horror. What if these journalists are still here? And if you were trapped with her? The radio hissed again. His chest opens as he looks at the dashboard. The car felt cold, as if the very air inside it was becoming denser. And then, the radio turned on by itself, as it had done before. A voice echoed through the static. Do you think it cuts the cycle? Guillermo felt his throat dry. The legend always repeats itself. The static rose, and then what came next made his blood run cold. A succession of suggestions via the radio. Multiple voices. Javier Ibarra, Marcos del Valle, Hugo Ramirez, Guillermo Garcia. The last voice was his own. Guillermo almost lost control of the steering wheel. His mind screamed that this wasn't possible, but it was. The car. Radio turned off by itself. The silence returned, oppressive. But now he knew the truth. No one ever left that road. And he would not be an exception. Guillermo's car advanced silently along the road, but he no longer knew if he was really going anywhere. What if you were just driving in circles? The radio was off, but he could still hear the echo of names being whispered. Journalists like him, investigators, people who sought the truth and disappeared. But why? What La Mala Hora really was it? He flipped through Alejandro Ferrer's diary again. searching for any clue that might make sense. The notes were increasingly chaotic, frantic scribbling and repeated words. Then I found a passage that was underlined in several parts. She's a flexion. It is not just a spirit. It is a mirror of the souls of those who see it. She feeds on despair and guilt. Guillermo frowned. A mirror? How could this be? He remembered again the woman in black in the rearview mirror. The way his face never seemed fixed, like it was always molding itself. What if she didn't have a face because she wore his? A chill ran up his spine. Every victim of La Mala Hora, he seemed to be someone who carried secrets, past mistakes, unresolved guilt. What if she wasn't killing these people, but rather devouring their sins? He tried to remember the stories he read before he began his investigation. Some versions said that La Mala Hora appeared to those who were about to die, but other people talk about something deeper, that she was a warning, a punishment. Then, another memory struck him like lightning. Oh, police officer at the station. The way they didn't want to talk about Javier Ibarra. And if the city's inhabitants, have you already heard about the entity? What if that stretch of road wasn't just cursed? What if it was a cemetery for sinners? The car's engine groaned and a shiver ran across his skin. In the back of his mind, a terrible certainty began to form. He was there for a reason, and maybe he was not innocent. Alejandro Ferrer's diary trembled in Guillermo's hands. La Mala Hora was not just a haunting. She was a reflection, a shadow of the sins of those who crossed her path. But who was originally to blame? He responded quickly. He knew exactly where to look. Guillermo made his way back to the city and stopped, in front of the police station. This time I wouldn't leave without answers. Upon entering, he encountered the same scowling police officer who had thrown him out earlier. The man sighed when he saw him, as if he already knew he would return. "I need to know the truth about that road," Guillermo said firmly. The policeman crossed his arms. "Go away." "I know you know," Guillermo insisted, slamming the diary on the counter. "This road has been a black hole for disappearances. For decades. Nobody talks about it, but everyone knows. I need to know who was the first victim." The silence that fell was suffocating. The officer looked away, but the older officer behind him coughed. The man looked tired, as if he had been carrying a weight on his shoulders for years. Then he finally spoke. Her name was Camila Vargas. Guillermo's breath hitched for a moment. What happened to her? The old policeman looked him in the eyes. Before responding, "She was murdered on that road." The answer came like a cold blade to the skin. Murdered by whom? The younger officer snorted and turned away, but the older one continued. "Nobody knows for sure. Camilla was a young woman working as a waitress in a roadside bar. One night I left work and never came home. The next day, I found his body in a ravine. And her face." He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath before continuing. Her face was deformed. How they made smoothies so much that the bones no longer existed. Guillermo felt bile rise in his throat. And the killer? The swing policed. The head slowly. "I never found out. I never did anything. Some say he was a truck driver, others that he was an important man in the city. But no one wanted to investigate. The police at the time hushed everything up. The case was never resolved." A shiver ran up Guillermo's spine. He felt as if something cold enveloped him. "Do you think she's back?" The older police officer looked at him seriously. "She never left." The silence between the three men stretched for a long moment. Camila Vargas, the first victim, the woman who never got justice, and now she demanded blood. The name Camila Vargas echoed in Guillermo's mind like a funeral bell. Now he knew the truth. La Mala Hora was not just an entity that terrorized travelers. She was a victim, a brutally murdered woman whose story was forgotten by time. And now, she charged those who, like her killer, carried secrets and sins. But why he? The journalist left the police station feeling the weight of what had been discovered, but something wasn't right. The world around him felt different. The city, once empty, now seemed even quieter. No sound, no wind, not a single soul lives on the streets. When he got into the car and started the engine, the clock on the dashboard blinked erratically. 03 age 15. 02 age 47. 030. Time no longer makes sense. He rubbed his eyes, trying to avoid tiredness, and sped back to the road. But as you drive, see something scary. He was passing the same stretch of road over and over again. The same dead tree, the same rusty plate, the same abandoned car. He wasn't going anywhere. Despair began to take over him. He opened the steering wheel with force, trying to rationalize. Maybe he was just exhausted. Perhaps the fog was distorting his perception. It was then that the radio turned on by itself. Static filled the car, and a female voice whispered something that made his blood run cold. "You still don't remember, Guillermo?" The journalist feels his stomach turn. "Remember what?" he murmured, but his own voice sounded distant, as if he were speaking from a dream. Looking in the rearview mirror, saw something impossible. Himself. Guillermo was standing in the middle of the road, looking directly at himself. The reflection spoke incorrectly, and his voice was distorted over the radio. "You know what you did." Guillermo felt out of breath. This couldn't be happening. He closed his eyes, rubbing his face with his hands. When I opened it again, the road was different. The asphalt disappears. He was standing on a dirt road surrounded by dead trees. But he knew this place. It was where Camila Vargas had been found dead, his chest open. Why was he there? And then a voice came, whispered by the wind. But this time, it didn't come from the radio, it came from inside him. "You need to remember." The cold wind blew across the dirt road, carrying the smell of a forgotten past. Guillermo felt the pressure in his chest increase. Why was he there? How there was a point in the exact spot where was Camila Vargas murdered. He got out of the car, with shaky legs. The silence around was absolute, as if the entire world was holding its breath. The dry ground crunched beneath his feet as he approached an old ravine. "That's where I found her body." Guillermo felt a sudden dizziness. His vision flickered. For an instant, he was no longer on the empty road. It was back to the other night. The darkness was dense. The smell of alcohol permeated the air. Guillermo was inside an old car, the headlights illuminating the dirt road. He was not alone. In the passenger seat, a young man was crying. His eyes were red. His hands were shaking. "Please, let me go." Guillermo's heart stopped. He knew that voice, Camila Vargas. The dizziness came back like a blow. The scene fragmented like breaking glass, and suddenly he was back on the present road, panting, with cold sweat running down his forehead. What the hell had he just seen? He staggered back to the car and picked up Alejandro Ferrer's diary, flipping through the pages frantically. He really understood. And then, I found something that had never been noticed before. On the last page, beneath the words, "She already knows who you are," was a name scrawled. Your own name, Guillermo Garcia. The blood ran cold in his veins. Why was your name in the diary? How did Alejandro know? He left his cell phone, and even though there was no reception, he opened his photo gallery. He scrolled through the images as if hoping to find something that would explain the suffocating feeling inside him. And then, among the unimportant photos, I found one that I didn't remember taking. An old photo. In black and white, it was a photo of Camila Vargas, and behind her a group of men, laughing, men who were with her the night of her murder, and one of them was him. The cell phone fell from his hands. His breathing became erratic. No, it wasn't possible, but he knew it was true. He'd been on that road before. He was part of the curse, and now, La Mala Hora, I wanted your soul. The world around Guillermo seemed to spin. He was part of the curse. His face in the photo, alongside other men, laughing behind Camila Vargas, was irrefutable proof that he was there on the night of the crime. But why? Why don't you remember? Shiver ran down his spine as a horrible thought crossed his mind. What if he hadn't forgotten? What if the road brought him back whenever he tried to escape the truth? The car radio turned on by itself, the hiss filling the oppressive silence of the night. Then her voice came, low and drawn out. Now you know. The air lingered as if an invisible force was heavy. Guillermo felt dizzy. His knees gave way and he fell to his knees in the middle of the road. She was there. The mist thickened around. Him and the silhouette of the woman in black emerged from the darkness, walking towards him with distorted movements, as if trapped between two worlds. But this time his face began to change. It was no longer just a shapeless shadow. It was Camila Vargas's face. The black eyes, deep and dead, were fixed on him, and for the first time she spoke without whispering. You were one of them, Guillermo. The journalist felt short of breath. I don't... He tried to deny it, but his own voice sounded weak, insincere. I remember you. You saw what they did to me, and you didn't do anything. Guillermo began to tremble. Was it true? Was he really there and allowed that? The entity changed until its shadow completely enveloped him. Her voice was now an inspiration inside his mind. Now you have a choice. The temperature dropped even further, and he felt a deep pain in his chest. His body seemed to fall apart, his consciousness being pulled away. Or you accept what you did and come with me. The image of Javier Ibarra, Marcos del Valle, and all the other missing journalists crossed his mind. They were also sucked into the road. They were all called for the same reason. Everyone was part of the cycle. Or you break this curse and pay the price. Guillermo closed his eyes. He knew what I needed to do, but the question was, would he have the courage? The road around Guillermo seemed to have ceased to exist. There was only him and the entity. The air was thick, heavy, as if time itself was bowing to her presence. Camila Vargas, or what was left of her, continued to stand before him. His face, now defined, was no longer just a shadowy blur. She wasn't an eyesore. She was a woman betrayed by injustice. Choice. Her voice echoed in his mind, without needing to move her lips. Guillermo felt the truth weigh on his shoulders. There was no way to escape. The road always, or the trail back. He'd been there before, and he'd probably been there many times, in cycles that his mind tried to erase. And now he had three options. 1. Give yourself completely. To leave La Mala Hora, take it. Become part of the road, another missing. Erase your memory, living without ever remembering what you did, but condemned to wander the world with no identity, no past, no answers. Give your life as a sacrifice. Accept the blame and break the cycle, ensuring no one else was drawn into the curse. He took a deep breath, his chest hurting. I had to decide. If I forget, say, will this end? His voice was shaky. Camilla's eyes glittered with something that seemed pity. If you forget, it will come back. It will always come back. He closed his eyes, causing hot tears to escape. I didn't want, did I? But maybe that's what always should have happened. He knelt down, facing Camilla directly. His body no longer trembled. Take me. Camilla tilted her head as if evaluating her decision. The surrounding fog seemed to dissolve a little. Do you accept what you did? Guillermo closed his eyes, letting the past consume him. He remembered. From the night of the crime, of the muffled laughter, of the young woman begging for help while he remained silent, from the weight of cowardice. He opened his eyes and nodded. Try. The road shook. The mist swirled around them like a whirlwind, and Guillermo felt a biting cold cut through him like a blade. He knew he wouldn't survive here, but for the first time, he was free. The cold took over Guillermo's body. His vision went dark, and he felt like he was being pulled into an endless abyss. The distant road, the mist swallowed him completely. For a moment, it doesn't exist. Then the silence was romanticized by a familiar beep heart monitor. Guillermo opened his eyes. He was lying in a hospital bed. The smell of disinfectant and the blinding white light made him blink several times. His arms were attached to wires and tubes. The heart was beating fast. He tried to move, but a huge weight pressed down on his chest. A nurse entered the room, surprised to see him awake. "My God, you're back," he exclaimed. Guillermo blinked in confusion. "I went back?" His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't used it in a while. The nurse quickly adjusted the devices. "You were in a coma for 3 months. I found your car overturned on the road. You were lucky to survive. Eat. 3 months. A road. La Mala Hora. Was it all a dream?" Guillermo's chest opened. He tried to remember, but his mind felt like a fog. There were gaps, some pieces missing. He knew something happened on that road, but what? The nurse hears your concern and looks gently. "You don't need to worry about that right now. The important thing is that you're alive." She turned to leave, but before closing the door, she paused. I almost forgot. A police officer came here a few weeks ago. He left this for you." She placed a crumpled envelope on the table next to the bed. When a nurse arrived, Guillermo reached out with a trembling hand and opened the envelope. Inside, there was just a piece of yellow paper with a single sentence written on it. "You've already been marked." His body froze, his heart raced, and then, there is no reflection from the hospital window glass. He saw the woman in black, smiling, waiting. The road never ended. She always returns. And one day, he'll come after you too.